So, hello guys, and welcome back to this Italian game series. This is the first video where we're going to be really diving into the details of each variation. We're starting now with the Greco Gambit, the traditional line. Now, if you haven't seen the overview, the introductory video, I would recommend that you check that out so you guys can have the framework, the structure of the opening and understand, what you guys are getting yourselves into. So go ahead and check that if you haven't seen it, but if you have, then let's dive right in to the Greco Gambit, the traditional line. So, how does this begin? Well, pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, bishop c4, and here the classical line, bishop to c5. Black develops one of his kingside pieces and will soon develop his knight and castle his kingside. So, rather symmetrical play. The major difference, of course, is that white has developed the king's knight and black has developed his queen's knight. Now, because black has developed his queen's knight, he cannot fight in the center with c6 and d5. However, white, since his queen's knight is still on b1, can actually do so. So this is how they started to play in the very early days of this opening. They would play the move pawn to c3. Now, black's major principled response, it's not the only one, but the one that we're going to focus on is knight f6. This attacks the pawn on e4, and as we said in the introductory video, if white now defends the pawn with a move like pawn to d3, then we're no longer in any sort of Greco Gambit positions, and we go back into Giuoco Pianissimo, more quiet games still than the Giuoco Piano positions that arise from c3. Now, instead, here, the Greco Gambit will arise after the move pawn to d4. Black must capture this pawn. We will see in one of the model games that if black does not capture this pawn, but instead plays a move like bishop to b6, then after the move pawn takes e5, it will very, very quickly spell disaster. We will take a look at that in the model games section, so check it out. Now, therefore, black must take on d4. White will now recapture on d4, and at first sight, life looks very good for white because he has what's called the ideal center. e4, d4, d5, and e5, these are the central squares, the absolute core of the center, and white has two pawns, whereas black has none. However, there is one major defect in the white position, if not two. The major defect that I'm referring to is this pawn on e4 is undefended. And the second possible defect is that the king is exposed. It's exposed along this diagonal. So black has one saving move, and that is bishop to b4 check. It turns out that this is a very, very annoying move for white to face, because if white now plays a natural move like knight to c3, black absolutely can take this pawn here on e4, because knight takes knight is not possible since the knight is pinned. Hence, white is sacrificing or gambiting a pawn, and from this, the name Greco Gambit is derived. Now, white also has a couple of other options. The moves bishop to d2 or knight to d2 instead. However, I have to be honest, none of these moves are satisfactory entirely for white. They're great options at the club level, but as you face stronger and stronger players that know a lot of theory, you're not going to pose many problems as white. So let's check out why that is the case. So the first variation that we're going to show is the natural move bishop to d2. The problem here is that after bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, queen to b3, attacking this knight. Here, black has two very, very good options. Knight to a5, striking at both the bishop and the queen, or knight c to e7, simply defending this knight on d5. And the problem is that black has more or less solved all of his issues here in the center with this knight on d5 being attacked. Of course, he couldn't just move this knight since the pawn on f7 would be falling. So black has solved his problems, and long term, white has this what we call an isolated pawn. It's isolated because it has no pawn next to it on the files next to it, E file or the C file. And this, in the future, especially in an endgame, can be really problematic. In fact, this position is so tame from a white perspective that after the move knight a5, most games actually continue queen a4 check. Black takes care of the check and takes care of his knight, brings it back. Now white goes queen b3, renewing the thread, and after knight a5, queen a4, knight c6, queen b3, 90% of the games have ended in a draw. So this position is really not such a clever way to play if you're fighting for an advantage as white. So let's return to the starting position. Black had a bishop on b4, and he gave this check. The knight is here, there is a pawn here. Now black has given this check. White has to consider which way to defend. We've already seen that the move knight to d2 after pawn d5 is not very compelling. In addition to this, black actually can just get away with capturing this pawn. And these positions are also quite good for black. We won't get into it because the move d5 is comfortable equality, but you should know that knight takes e4 is also an annoying possibility for white to face. So therefore, knight d2 is not so convincing. The other try is the move bishop to d2. So we've looked at the move bishop d2, and we've said that black can play bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, and then play d5. But he can also play the move knight takes e4. Now, after knight takes e4, bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, and this position is also very good for black. White has the move bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and he's down a piece, but after the move queen b3 check, the knight is caught here, and so after pawn to d5, white is able to recover his piece on b4, but the thing is that black is not so concerned about having lost this pawn or having his king a little bit weak because there aren't that many pieces left on the board. In fact, black could play, rather than the move d5, black could deal with this check by playing king f8, and after queen takes knight, we have queen e7, x-raying the king and attacking the queen, and after queen takes queen, king takes queen, we get this position, and it's very boring position, very bland. Black's king is a little bit open, but there's not many pieces left on the board. And as we know, in an endgame, having the king in the center is actually more often than not is a good thing. So let's return to the position that we were initially talking about, which is with the pieces here. Now, black has just given this check, and we were talking about the move bishop to d2. What happens if knight b to d2? In this case, black can just play d5. Once again, striking in the center hits the pawn on e4 and the bishop on c4. And after pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, black is once again safe, and the pawn on d4 is a real liability in the future. So black once again has no problems. Therefore, the white player would play this move knight to c3. This is the Greco Gambit. Now, the big problem for white is that after knight takes e4, it turns out that black is doing very well. Computer analysis, modern computers are really, really powerful, much better than humans, and all the computer analysis shows that black is doing very well. And in fact, black scores more wins than white from this position. So I cannot recommend this at the higher levels, but at the club level, it's a great gambit to play for an adventurous game. Let's see how it continues. White here will castle, offering a second pawn on c3. And black has a question to answer. Does he capture with the knight? or does he capture with the bishop? One of the great things if you're a club player is that many players will make the mistake of capturing the knight with the knight because they want to keep both of their bishops. And after pawn takes bishop, they greedily capture this pawn on c3. Now, black is attacking the rook and he's 2 pawns up. So the position looks great for black, but the problem is his king is still in the center of the board while white has castled. And this bishop is deep in white's half of the position and it's undefended. So here, Gioacchino Greco, after whom the gambit is named, analyzed the move queen to b3. This move offers a rook on top of the 2 pawns, and it seems simply a lot of material to sacrifice, but in fact, if black captures this rook, then white will take on f7 with check, and after the move king f8, white will continue to develop his pieces with bishop to g5, and we see that the black queen is under attack, and she has absolutely no square to run to. Therefore, black must block, knight to e7, and white's development is so powerful here that with a move like rook to e1, we see that the pressure on this knight on e7 is too great, and the black position is in fact crumbling. It doesn't matter that black is up 2 pawns and a rook, because look at all of the white pieces, they're all in play. And look at the black king, very unsafe compared to the white king, and look at the majority of the black pieces. Almost all of them are on the back rank, and the only 2 that aren't is this knight, which is horribly pinned, and this bishop on a1, which is totally out of the game. So this position is in fact winning for white. So black shouldn't play like this. So let us return now to the original position here with the queen on b3. The pawn is on f7, the knight is on c6, and there is no knight here. And so in this position here, with the bishop still on c1, white's move queen b3, we just looked at the fact that after bishop takes rook, bishop takes f7 is lethal. But black has a good move here. He can play the move pawn to d5. And he attacks this bishop. Now, if queen takes bishop, we take this bishop, and black is doing well. And if bishop takes d5 here, now black can castle, because the bishop on c3, if white takes it, then queen takes bishop. The whole point of this move d5 by black was to invite the bishop to go from c4 to d5, so that after white takes the bishop, black captures on d5. And once again, now that the dust has settled, let's take note of this position. Each side has a queen, each side has 2 rooks, each side has a knight and a bishop. Let's look at the pawns. White has 5 pawns, black has 6 pawns, and so white is down a pawn, and on top of that, he has that isolated pawn once again. So we really don't like this line for white after all. This was Greco's analysis originally, but it turns out to be not so good. It's quite good for black. So let's go back and let's ask ourselves the question. If after the move bishop to c4, if the move queen to b3 is in fact not so good after d5, then surely this is very good for black. But we started off by saying that bishop takes c3 is maybe not the best way for black to play. And in fact, the answer lies in the so-called Aitken variation. Bishop to a3 instead of queen b3 is much stronger. It holds the black king, prevents him from castling, and now a move like pawn to d5 will be very, very dangerous because of the fact that black's king is stuck in the center. And so it turns out bishop to a3 is really, really strong for white, and black should therefore not play like this. Black is in a lot of trouble here. So, how should black play? It turns out that black should simply capture with the bishop. Now, the point is that after pawn takes c3, unlike when he captured with the knight, the situation was like this. So his bishop was under fire, and when he took, he found himself in trouble. First to ideas like queen b3, and second to ideas like bishop a3, keeping his king in the center of the board. So instead, now what he's done is he's captured with the bishop, and after pawn takes, there is no piece en prise, and this buys him time. And black uses that time to play the very useful move, pawn to d5. Now the bishop is attacked, and black is prepared to castle on the king side in the next move. If white moves his bishop back anywhere, black will castle, and if white plays bishop a3, this doesn't work because black can simply capture this bishop on c4. This is the big problem that white faces in this variation. So this used to be a very, very popular line to play, but later on, after Greco's analysis, it used to be very popular, but eventually it went out of fashion when the black players started to realize that if they captured on c3, then the situation would be really, really good for the black player. The line was revived a little bit when white decided he could simply leave the bishop there and instead play the move pawn to d5. This move is really a crazy move, attacking the knight on c6 and saying, I don't need to take the bishop just yet. The problem is that in the beginning it caused a headache for black, but eventually the black player realized that there were at least two good ways of dealing with this. One that we won't spend time looking at is knight to e5. This is a good move for black. However, the main line, black simply keeps his bishop, brings it back to f6. Now, white has a choice. He can take this knight, or he can play rook e1. If he takes the knight, then after pawn takes c6, black is ready to meet the move rook e1 with pawn to d5, supporting the knight and attacking the bishop, and he has a very stable center. We have to realize that black is currently up 2 pawns. So even if white does something like bishop d3, black castles, and bishop takes e4, pawn takes e4, and white eventually captures this pawn on e4, black is going to be quite happy because he's still up a pawn, and if white captures this way, black will be left with the 2 bishops and white will have had to sacrifice his 2 bishops. So for this reason, white does not capture the knight on c6, but instead plays rook to e1. The line continues knight e7, rook takes e4, and here pawn to d6. If black does not spend time playing pawn to d6, then after castle, white himself can toy with the possibility of placing the pawn on d6, and this will frustrate black's development. So this is why the main line is simply pawn to d6. The bishop is developed, and black is getting ready to castle on the next move. Here, white plays bishop g5. He has a lot of activity on the e-file, and he has better development because black's king still hasn't castled. So he has to do something fast, because if you look at the position, right now, black has 7 pawns, and white has only 6. And on top of that, white's pawn on d5 is an isolated pawn. Once again, we revisit this theme. So after bishop g5, black cannot ignore the situation and castle, because after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, we see that black's kingside structure is shattered and his king will be very unsafe. So therefore, in this position, black simply captures on g5. Knight takes g5, and here it's really a crazy situation, because if you're a club player, what you might expect white to do here is the move kingside castle. This is a very natural move, so it seems really surprising that a move like as natural as castling could lead to any real problems for black. But in fact, in the computer era, we see some crazy lines that have been worked out, in some cases, right up until the end. Lines that are very difficult for a human to work out, but with computer assistance, the top players, they know all of this stuff by heart. And here is one such line. It turns out that white can actually take this pawn on h7, sacrificing the knight, and the idea is that after king takes h7, white will go queen h5 check. Black has only one move. The king must go back to g8. And here we see white's idea, rook to h4. With the h file now open, white threatens mate either with queen h7 or with queen h8, and black's only good way of preventing checkmate is to move the f-pawn. His best bet is pawn to f5. Now white will continue with queen h7 check, and black must run king to f7. Now, in this position, if black had only one tempo, he would find many different solutions, and he would keep his extra piece. But for example, one move that black would like to play is knight to g6, attacking the rook, and then maybe bring the queen over, and suddenly all the black pieces are defending very, very well. But it's white's move. Now white plays rook h6. And with this move, he prevents knight to g6 ideas. The best move that black has is to support here on g7 and play the move rook to g8. White brings his final piece into the attack, rook to e1. Black's best bet is queen f8. Now we keep saying black's best bet, and so what you must notice is that there is a lot more room for black to go wrong than for white to go wrong, and that's a situation you usually don't want to find yourself in. After queen f8, white plays bishop to b5, covering some important squares and preventing black's idea to run with the king over to the queen side. After bishop b5, black has nothing better than rook h8. Queen takes h8, and now g takes h6. That was the idea. I offer a rook to break the pin, and now I capture on h6. So far so good, and black retains his extra piece. But the problem is that after queen h7 check, king f6, it looks as though all the checks are done, and black has kept his piece, and he's on his way to victory. But white has one final sacrifice in store. Rook takes e7. White has for now regained his piece. Black must accept queen takes e7. And the idea is after queen takes h6, black has only two options. Either he runs with the king to e5, or he steps back with the king to f7. The final two white pieces combine so effectively that in either case, black is stuck in what is known as a repetition of checks or a perpetual check. Let me show you the first option, king e5. White will go queen e3 check. Black cannot take the pawn because the queen is falling, so he must go back, and after queen h6, we can see that there is simply a repetition. That could go on forever. If king f7, on the other hand, then white plays queen h7 check. And again, if king f6, queen h6, it's once again back to the starting position. If king f8, queen h8, and it's the same. And look at the importance of this bishop on b5. It covers the e8 square. So therefore, this position is simply a draw by repetition. A completely crazy line, but guys, if you're going to play this as black, you simply must know that if you castle immediately, you are going to allow white the option to force a draw if he wants it. So the position that we were looking at, and I don't blame you if by now you have forgotten, but the position was exactly like this with the rook on a1. And here we were saying that if black castles, then knight takes h7 is a real dangerous move. And so black instead takes a tempo to kick the knight away. Now, if white simply drops with the knight back, he will castle. There is no danger here, and life is good. And if you take stock of the material, we see that black is still up a pawn. So white has one final idea in store. He will go queen to e2, and he will ignore this knight. Black takes on the challenge, and now we see white's idea. Rook e1, tripling up on the e-file, and this knight cannot be defended. White may be down a pawn, but he hopes to have a really dangerous attack. But black has one final resource, which killed this variation from the white perspective. If you wish, you can stop the video now and try and figure out what is the best move for black here. Okay, I will now show. The move is bishop to e6. Now, this offers back the extra piece, but not the knight. Instead, offers the bishop, and after pawn takes bishop, now black plays f6 and makes this entire heavy piece battery along the e-file look quite silly, because this pawn here on e6, this white pawn on e6, actually is helping black. Imagine the position without the pawn on e6, black would just have to resign. But with the pawn on e6, suddenly all of white's pieces are banging up against his own brick wall, so to speak. Black maintains his extra pawn, and yes, it's true, the black king is a little bit unsafe, but on the other hand, black has ideas like pawn to c6 and d5, claiming his fair share of the center. He is an extra pawn to the good, and this knight, in the long run, may become a better piece than the bishop on c4, which is right now blocked by the pawn on e6. The results speak for themselves. Black has a lot more wins in practice from this position than white. And this, in my opinion, is the major reason why the main line of the main traditional line of the Greco Gambit has fallen out of fashion. And in the next video, what we're going to look at is the Greco Gambit modern line. What are the top guys doing these days when they do play c3 and d4? So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot. I know that there were a lot of crazy variations. Feel free to go over the video once again. And feel free to investigate these positions in your own time by yourself. Other than that, that's it from me, and I hope to see you in the next video.